the API limits and entitlements, which this session is about, is partly about trying to sort of just iron out what the differences between the API service protections or API limits are and what the entitlements are. And then there's some new, they were released a couple of news regarding the entitlement limits during Ignite. So I will be discussing those as well. So because they're very important news. Who am I? My name is Gustav Westerlund. As you can see me at the bottom here in the right-hand corner and on the picture. I've been lucky enough to get the MVP award 10 times in a row now. I also founded a company in 2010. I was alone at that time, but now we're 27 people, so that's great. I really like that. And I primarily work as a solution architect, so I'm not the managing director of our company. Because I really love working with technology and do that. Okay, so first of all, just to separate these two concepts from each other, and I think this is very, very important because I've actually noticed that that even Microsoft support haven't always known the difference between these, and also the local Microsoft representatives don't always know the difference between these. And when you start talking to them about, oh, isn't there a licensing cost to using the APIs? They're like, no, it's just the throttling. So it doesn't actually cost anything. So on the left hand side we have what's called entitlements, and on the right hand side we have the API service protection, as you can see. So and the important thing here is that these are both meant to sort of protect the purpose why they're there is that they're there to protect the stability of the service, but they're there on two very different perspectives. The entitlements are there to sort of give a fair use of the for like compute to the particular tenant, and the API service protection is to protect a particular instance from sort of like spamming the instance and the APIs too much during a very short period of time. So the entitlements are measured on a 24-hour basis. And on the API service protection are measured on a 5-minute rolling window. So they're very different in how they actually measure. And on the if you break the API service protections, it will actually just give you an exception, and you won't be able to use the API for that user for like a particular amount of time, typically like 4 minutes, because that's how the rolling window, 4 or 5 minutes. The entitlements, on the other hand, they haven't been enacted yet, so what they've said, Microsoft, and I'm coming back to this, is that they will be releasing a report. This report is currently in private preview. I heard that you were discussing the capacity center. It will actually be in the capacity center in the PPAC, so you can find it there. Will be able to download that. You can generate a report, and you can download this API usage report, and that's how you will be able to figure it out. Currently, there are some limitations to the reporting and the dashboarding of the API. So I do sort of warn a bit against relying too much on that data, but it does give you some indication though. But the entitlements, if you use them over what you are entitled to based on your licenses, you will have to pay more. And as the last point points out here, the capacity add-on, you will be able to buy 50,000 more API calls for $50 per month. And this is measured on a 24-hour basis. So it's if you have, I'll come back to an example later on. The API service protection, on the other hand, is not connected in any way to a particular license. It's the same for everyone, even if you have a Power Apps per app license, or if you're using a full sales enterprise. It doesn't really matter. But the entitlements are dependent on the licensing, and I'm coming back to that as well. And then there's also on the entitlement side, there's different ways of calculating this and summing it up based on user and then on the non-licensed user perspective as well. And on the entitlement side, you can buy yourself out of this problem if you're overusing the APIs. You can just buy more of these add-ons. But on the API service protection side, there's actually no way to actually just throw money at Microsoft and get more, except buying like your own tenant. Like there's possibility to buy more or less like your own server in that's, but that's very, very expensive, and I typically haven't worked with any customer that's done that. So first of all, I think it's very important to understand what is actually a request, because there's a chance that people are misunderstanding what a request is, and it is, first of all, it's like every message that's handled by the platform, like a create, read, update, or delete, plus even like assigns and on these types of and share. So these are all counted as a request. It's actually counted not on the API front-end side. It's counted a bit further down into the platform, which means that if you generate some kind of cascading behavior, like for instance, if you have set that if you have the relationship between account and opportunity is said to be cascade delete, and you delete the account, that could actually delete like 10 opportunities as well. And that would mean that the delete of one account actually generates 10 or 11 requests in that case. So you have to be aware of that. And since the default setting for the cascade relationships between, for instance, activities and accounts and activities and contacts is to be parental, I think it's set to, which means that it will automatically delete all the activities. One delete can actually generate quite a lot of these of requests. There's also often a misunderstanding or misconception around the batching. This was Microsoft, when they announced this, they did say that you can use batching, and if you like batched 10 creates into one batch, that would count as one call. However, they changed that, so it is no longer counted as one. If you batch 10 creates into one batch, that will actually be counted as 11 requests. It will be 1 for unpacking the batch and then 10 for each of the creates. Batching is still very useful from a performance perspective, and I've discussed this on my blog. So where I've actually tried out like creating 100,000 records with different settings on the how many threads you're using, how large batches, and the difference is actually very, very large. I think it's, if I used 16 threads and 10 in each batch, I created 100,000 records in about 45 minutes. But if I just used 1 in each batch, then it took me like 7 hours instead, but still if I had a lot of threads. So the difference is very large. I'm discussing sort of lots of other dependencies to that, so it's a bit hard to sort of say that. It is also independent of which channel you're using, which means that if I'm using the API or I'm using the UI, that doesn't really matter. It's or if I'm creating a workflow, for instance, or doing something through a plugin, they are all counted. So you can't really work yourself around it. From that perspective, it's actually what's counted down a bit further down in the platform. And do note that assigns and shares are also counted. However, logins and some of the metadata requests or messages are not counted. There is also a slight difference from what I've understood anyway. It's not very clear, but from what I've understood when I've read the documentation, between how a request is defined when you're counting it from an API service protection perspective and the API entitlement perspective. So for instance, the requests are calculated on a per front end server in the API service protection perspective, but that's not the case how they're counted in the API entitlements, where they're counted for the entire tenant. And if you have several different instances, you might actually be using multiple. You typically get like 6 front-end servers, and if you have lots of instances, you can have different front-end servers as well. So it's there are some slight differences to that, which can be very useful to understand when working with this. Yes, so let's start with the API entitlements. First of all, as I mentioned, this will go. There will be a report that's going to be released. Probably, I would say around January, February, and 6 months after this report has been made available, they will start enforcing this, which means that you will have to start paying for it. It's all usage as a user, as I mentioned previously. It doesn't matter which channel you're using, UI or API or workflow or plugin. Usage is calculated per user. So you will be entitled to a certain amount of usage per user, which means that the users that are large types of users will get 40,000 requests or calls per day. That includes Power Apps per user, the Dynamics 365 Pro licenses and above. If you have a smaller type of user, like a Power Apps, it says Power Apps per user. You should say Power Apps per app, or a team member license. You will get 6,000 calls per user. And then there's also a special pooled handling of all the non-licensed users. I'm coming back to what a non-licensed user is, and the non-licensed users will share 500,000 calls plus 5,000 calls per larger Dynamics user. You won't get anything for any Power Apps per app or Power Apps per user at this time. So there's different grouping of users here, and they're affected a bit differently. And an important thing is that Microsoft says that based on the telemetry they have, this will affect less than 5% of all instances, or 5% of all tenants, sorry. So it shouldn't affect most customers, but of course there are customers that will be affected by this. And just to sort of understand the perspective of what they're trying to make things a bit fair. So if you have if you create a solution where you have like 5 users and you're using 10 million API calls a day, you are not actually paying for the amount of compute that you are generating on their backend side in Azure. So that means that they think that that would cause costs that are actually then being paid by other users, and that's not what it's not really fair. So you should pay your fair share, and this is how the model that they're sort of implementing to make sure that you actually pay for your fair share. And having 5 users and using 10 million calls is not really fair. So that's sort of the point behind this, and I do actually think that it's a fair point. So I'm not against that in itself. Then you can always discuss the model, and they just changed this model. The previous model was that before Ignite was 20,000 per user. There were lots of different variations, so they made it a bit simpler now with just 40,000 and 6,000, and so that's also good. And then especially large change now is for the non-licensed users. Those were previously just at 100,000, and there was no way that you could increase that based on the amount of users you had. So you actually got 100,000 for just if you were 5 users, or if you were 50,000 users, you would get like 100,000 anyway. The last one, the non-licensed users, there is a cap to that, which is 10 million. So if you do reach that many users, that you will get like actually entitled to above 10 million, I would recommend that you talk to your account representative at Microsoft and discuss this with them, because that's what it says in Microsoft documentation as well, that you should do that. So that's probably a good idea. Okay, so non-licensed users, what are those? So the non-licensed users are typically like this. The most common ones are the service principals. Then we have the non-interactive users, we have admin users, and we have system. Service principals are the application users, which are the best practice way of integrating today. They don't cost anything, and you can create as many as you want. And then it's very good from an API entitlement perspective, if you want to know what's integrated system is using what, to actually create one application user per integrations. They don't cost anything to set up, and you can also separate the license, the security based on each application user. That means that you can reduce the attack area from a security perspective as well, which is also best practice. So don't create just one application user and share that for all your integrations, but one application user per integration. There's just a small job of actually setting those up, but then it's a lot better. And the report that you will get from Microsoft, actually, which I've seen for some of my customers because we're in the private preview, will show the usage per user per day. So you'll see, for the integrate system X integration user, we had 50,000 calls, and then for this other system, that integration user that has 5 million calls. Okay, maybe we have to look at that system then. And the first system, it's not really a big problem. Then we have the non-interactive users. This is sort of a way of, I misspelled it. The non-interactive users are sort of a legacy way of handling legacy interactions or integrations. They're typically like a normal user. You create a normal user with a license so that they're created in the CRM system in a proper way. But then you mark them as non-interactive, and you remove the license from them. That will make it a non-interactive users. There's a limit to 5 users that you can only have 5 non-interactive users, but they don't cost anything as well. And then we have the admin users, and an admin user is typically like a global administrator or something like somebody like that that doesn't actually work in the system, but maybe adds users, assigns security roles and stuff like that. So those are admin users. They can't see the business side of Dynamics or in Power Platform. And then we have system. System was actually added just a few months ago to this. There's lots of things that Microsoft themselves or the CRM system is doing as system. And previously those weren't counted at all. They were sort of going under the radar. And there was like a sort of a hack that you could do that the way, for instance, for a workflow where you made that workflow run as a system. You assigned it to system and then it ran as the system. There's no win to doing that anymore. So you don't have to work. This is just the same by using service principals. Probably better to try to use service principals. You can't do that with workflows, so there's no point in that. There's some support for doing that in Power Automate, but it needs to be better. For the non-licensed users, if you have 100,000 per app users, Power Apps per app, and you have one single Dynamics 365 sales professional, you will get the full 500,000 base for that, and then you will get the 5,000 1 times 5,000 extra for that single professional user. So it's typically a good idea to just have that. I'm coming back to that later as well, but that's a good recommendation generally. If you're only using Power Apps or Power Automate, and you don't have any of the enterprise users, you will only get 25,000 calls. And the price, since you have to pay extra 50,000 calls for each, it's quite obvious that it's a good idea to just have one single enterprise user here. And there are systems that are whitelisted from entitlement perspective that are using particular application users, and one of these is Dynamics 365 Marketing. So the integration between marketing and the other part of the CRM system, since marketing has some parts that are outside of the Dataverse, those are whitelisted, so they don't count. So that's important to know. But currently, there's the interesting thing is what's not in this whitelist. For instance, the dual right between finance and operations and Dynamics sales using prospect to cash, for instance, that is not included in the whitelist, which means that that will actually use from your pool. So that is of course something that you need to think about. So how do we figure out how much APIs we're using? As you can see, this is a screenshot from one of my customers. It might be a bit hard to see, but you can actually see that they're using 10 million API calls. It's in Swedish, so it says the API calls is this one. So it's about a bit over 10 million API calls for this day that I set the filter for. But if you look here, it says CRM booking service. That's just above almost 1.2 million. And then the other ones don't sum up to the rest of this. So there's obviously something not really coherent in these reports. So I would trust this number more, the 10.4 million, than I would trust these graphs. But then once the official report is coming, then that is, of course, what you should be trusting. And I would do, if you think that if you are like using a lot of API calls, just like this customer, I do recommend you to try to sign up for the private preview of this report, so you can start acting on this quite as soon as possible. Do note that it's measured per tenant and not per instance, just like capacity in general, which means that if you have multiple production instances, they will all be using from the same pool here, especially for the non-licensed users, which is typically how you integrate, right? So be careful about that. So that's just try to get your head around this a bit anyway, as soon as possible, because it's if you need to do something about this, it might take some time. So further reading on the entitlements, I've read this several times, and every time they change it, I read it, and I still find it a bit hard. I might be dumb, but I still find it a bit hard sometimes to see what's actually about the entitlements and what's about the API service protections, especially when they're discussing the definition of what a request is. Is that okay? So is this a request? Is there a difference between there? And I actually asked some of my contacts in the product team, and they're like, "Oh, but that definition of a request is for entitlements, not for the API service protections." So just be very careful when you read it, and read it if this is something that's important for you or one of your customers. Read it very carefully and really try to understand it. And if you want to have a discussion with me, I'm happy to do that as well. Do have a read on that. And then I have a cost example, just so you know how to sort of calculate this. For 5 days, we have a usage of like 3.1 million, 3 million, 2.9 million, 3.1 million, a bit more, and then 2 million. And this is all done through integrations. We're using service principals. We have 100 sales enterprise users, which means that we will have 500,000 plus 5,000 times 100, which means that we will have 1 million included API calls. But then, of course, each capacity SKU is for 50,000 each, and that means that we will need the 3 million minus 3.1 million for because that was the largest. And we will just, if you look at the 3.114115, the fourth day there, that's the top one, and then we need to have a bit more than that, and I just went just above that, so it went to 3.15. Which covers that, and then I deducted the 1 million that's included, and then I divided the result by 50,000, which means that we need to buy 43 of those additional SKUs, and that would mean that we have an additional cost of $2,100 per month with the list prices here. So just to give you an example of what this is, and if you're up into the 10 millions or 20 millions, like some of my customers are, then you can just imagine these numbers. They will become drastically higher than this. And of course, I would recommend that if you have a partner or you are a customer, and you need to discuss this and need to handle this. And also, there's typically a reason why you're doing these many calls. So try to figure out why, and then try to see if there's ways you can refactor or fix things. Okay, so some tips on entitlements. try to batch or batching with 10 gives you 11 requests, just like I mentioned. That means that you shouldn't be using batches that are too small if you from an entitlement perspective, because then in this case the overhead is around 10%. If you're using a batch with 10, and if you have a batch with 20, you will only have an overhead of 5%, which is like not really being used. However, using really large batches isn't really useful from a performance perspective. So having like 100 in each batch, I've never gotten any decent performance from that, so I wouldn't recommend it. That's one of the aspects then. So be careful of the whitelisted that there are not currently any whitelisted applications. I would be really happy if we push Microsoft to, like, especially for the Dynamics products like Finance and Operations and Business Central, that they would be whitelisted as well. I find it a bit strange that if I have a customer and they buy Finance and Operations and they buy Dynamics Sales, the actual movement of data between these products using dual write would actually generate API calls that could cost the customer money, additional money. It's very hard to understand that from a customer perspective, and because but why? I bought these two things and they're all in the same suite. Why do I have to pay extra for the data that's being moved between them? That's strange. However, there's also, like, if you're using external marketing applications like Adobe Marketing and you're working with business to consumer, or you're using Click Dimensions, these types of applications that are for marketing, for instance, they typically generate a lot of data. You need to synchronize the list members, and that can be a lot of data that needs to be synchronized. I have customers that create new marketing lists with hundreds of thousands of members like several times a week. They just create new marketing lists all the time, which are synchronized to the marketing application. And that of course is not very useful. And then there's typically data coming back as well, where they have this customer clicked on this thing, they opened this email, and so on. So they have behavioral data, and if that's like in Adobe Marketing's case, there's saving that back as activities into Dynamics, and that will of course generate a lot of both data and from a storage perspective, but also API calls as well. So do have a look at that. And Adobe Marketing the integration they are using will be using a particular user, so you will be able to see that in the report as well. There's currently no way for ISVs to bundle requests. So ISV is like an external, so Adobe in this case, Adobe Marketing or Click Dimensions, they cannot bundle any requests. They can't say, like, if you buy this gold level of Adobe Marketing with the integration to Dynamics, we will include 10 million calls. There's no way they can do that. So customers and partners need to be very aware of the fact that certain integrations or certain add-ons might be causing a lot of API calls that can cost money for the customer when they need to start paying for the API entitlements. If you are in the case that you have a lot of calls, like for instance the one I showed you where we had 10 million, they don't have anywhere close to cover that. I think their current amount of users will cover like 3 million. You really need to start thinking about refactoring. So there's a reason why there's a problem. Have a look at that. Maybe start looking at pushing old data and the other data down into a data lake and surfacing that through Azure Synapse up to virtual entities or virtual tables. Maybe not updating everything all the time, using caching, for instance. So you cache the data a lot, so you don't have to ask Dynamics every time for every single thing, and use retrieve multiple when you can, for instance, and so on. So there's lots of different things that you can do, but it's really particular and specific to why these calls are being made. If you only have Power Apps, buy at least one Dynamics professional license or above, so that you can get the full. You would go from 25,000 to 500,000 API calls as the base, as a sort of base entitlement for the non-licensed users. That is, of course, if you are using some kind of integrations which do use the API a lot. Many Microsoft subs and partners and employees are unaware of this. Like Microsoft support have been unaware of this. And
We've just lost you there.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I had a problem with the. So I'll just grab a cable here. Sorry.
Oh, great. We've got you back now again.
Yes. Sorry.
Sorry, Gustav, we've lost you there. It was working, but now it's.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Awesome, great. Sorry about that. Where did you lose me? Was it around the Microsoft subs partners?
To be honest, we didn't actually lose you much. It was literally for one split second, so you can carry on. Thank you.
So just be aware that there are lots of Microsoft people that are unaware. We've had discussions with people at Microsoft just this spring, and this was the first part about entitlements was announced almost like 2 years ago. So this is actually not really news, but they haven't been. It hasn't been announced in a very official way. It's just been put into the documentation, and it's like, oh, didn't you read the memo? When I've discussed this with Microsoft support, they've been saying to customers, no, you don't have to worry about that. And it's like the customers are saying like, but it says so in the Microsoft documentation. Why would we not have to worry about it? And the communication about this has been a bit strange, I would say. If you have a partner or a customer or Microsoft reps that don't seem to know about this, then I think you need to make sure that they understand that this is actually happening. It doesn't seem to be fully set in stone yet. So I mean, we just got these changes at Ignite, which are great. I think they really reduced the price. The prices are around. They were reduced to about 20%, so like an 80% discount, which is great from their initial pricing. And also that we're now getting more based on the how many users you have even for the non-licensed users. So that's also good. But it's not set in stone, so do look out for changes. I will try to post those changes on my blog as well when I see them. I will discuss more details around this as well. So I think that's also important. Okay, so if we leave then the API service protection and go into the entitlements and go into the API service protection, which is also called the throttling in a more populistic term. The API service protection is measured on a 5-minute rolling window, which means that like during a particular 5 minutes, if you are exceeding this, you will be getting an exception. There are actually 3 different ways they're measuring. They're checking to see if you're overshooting this. The first one is the number of requests that you're sent. If the number of requests are more than 6,000, then you will be blocked. I think this is one of the area where the definition of a request is actually different than the entitlements, because I think in this case, if you're sending a batch, that's actually counted as 1 and not as the 11 that I had an example previously. So I think that using batching from that perspective is actually a good idea. The combined execution time is above 1,200 seconds, which that equates to about, if you were to use the system within like 4 threads in parallel for the entire 5 minutes, then you will be exceeding this. So that, but it's typically quite hard to just to do that by using 4 threads, because you won't be sending data to it all the time. But if you're using 16 threads, then you will definitely, and they're like 10 in every batch, then you will definitely hit this. So that's something that you need to think about. That's the typical thing I run into when I use Kingswaysoft, for instance, and try to integrate a lot of data. And then the last one is concurrent requests. So if I have more than 52 threads running towards Dynamics, then they will say that you can't use this many at a time. The important thing here is that from API service protection, they are counted by user and by front-end server. So by just adding, we have a customer in Germany that they are actually using, for one of the integrations, we're using 7 users to integrate that data, which actually means that we get 7 times the performance from the throttling. So that's something that they are actually recommending this in the documentation as well. So it's not an abuse of the system. So do use it that way. Be aware though that you will actually be using different users. So the data, if you write things to Dynamics, you might be seeing that the data has been been written by user X, for instance, or integration user 1 or integration user 5. So that can be a problem. There's ways to handle that in part, but not totally. So be careful about that if that's a problem for you. And then the last part of that is used by it's counted by the front-end servers, and as I mentioned, you're typically allocated around 6 front-end servers for per instance, and the default mechanism, which is used by the APIs and also the UI, is that the data is directed to by the network load balancer that's sitting in front of the system, is directed to one of these servers, because that would reduce, then that server can cache some of your data, and that would reduce the latency in the response that you're giving back. So that means that everything will go a bit faster. So that's typically a good thing from a sort of quickness of the integration, or quickness of whatever you're doing. If you have a JavaScript that you're trying to fetch some data from Dynamics, you want that to come back quite quickly, and not like having to use a non-cached experience. But from when when you're trying to push massive amounts of data towards the system, it's typically better to use all the 6 front-end servers. So you would want to separate that over, and the way to handle that is by there's something called the affinity cookie, and if you're using the affinity cookie, then that it will sort of, the network load balancer will know which front-end server to use. So we will keep using that server unless it's overloaded. But if you sort of if you're not using the affinity cookie, it will actually spread the data, the load over all these 6 front-end servers. So that's something that's important to know as well. And some tips for the API service protections. If you haven't implemented it already in your code, do catch the exceptions for this and back off. And use multiple servers, as I mentioned. There's no real reason why you shouldn't have multiple, or you couldn't use multiple application users or service principals, as they don't have any license cost. So if you're doing migrations, I would typically say have at least 3 or 4 users, maybe 1 user for reading data, if you're reading data from Dynamics, and then maybe 3 users for writing data. And then using tools that can use multiple users is also important. If that's, you can do it quite easily in code as well if you like, but there's also other applications like Kingswaysoft that can use it. It's quite easy to just set up several connections and then use those as well. Do use batching. It can give a lot of improved performance when you're using using the API. Sometimes I've found it's better to do like you blast the API for 5 minutes, and then you just like back off and you don't do anything. You actually build that into your code, so you don't even, when you get the exception, or you just like you do 4 minutes and 55 seconds of as much as you can, and then you just stop and wait. You don't even wait for the exception, and then you wait and then you wait a bit more, and you do it like on off for 5 minutes like that. The reason why I found this is that if that gives me a lot better, I can send more requests over time to the system by doing that than by sort of being nice and just sending like a lower amount of API calls that actually doesn't break the service protection. So it's that's also an interesting thing that I found, that can sometimes be a good strategy for working with this. And then we have the affinity cookie, which I just mentioned. And there's no way to buy yourself out of this. So you can't throw money at Microsoft, but you can actually, if you're doing a migrations, for instance, you can ask Microsoft to relax the throttles. And I've done this several times for several instances. So try to be nice and ask them about it, and you can typically get you can typically relax it a bit. They won't go away, but you can get a lot better performance out of it. So do ask them about if it's possible, saying that you're doing a large migration and you would like to have the throttles for this instance and this instance relaxed for the next 4 months or something. Then you can use that, but you probably won't be able to get it for eternity. And it's easier to get that kind of help if you have a customer that has lots of users. So that's about that part of my presentation. I think now we have some time for questions and answers. I don't know if you can help with that, Raz.
Thank you very much once again, Gustav. I wasn't, you actually went into a lot of detail there, so thank you for that. So there is a question. So there is a comment made by Philip Cole, saying avoiding service protection limits is another very good reason to set up different service principles for each environment. Otherwise, one environment can hit service protection limits and cause problems in different environments.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, fantastic. Abdul saying, you mentioned a key to use to hit the same server. What did you call it? Sorry, just missed that one.
It's called affinity cookie. So I think if you just Google Dataverse affinity cookie, you can find Microsoft have released code for just how to do this. So that you can find it in the Microsoft documentation. And I also think that it's one of the MVPs that wrote an article about this as well, that went into a lot more detail than I did in my blog. It actually showed what kind of effects he tried it out in detail with his code, and he could see the type of performance increase you got with that as well. I don't know exactly who it was. Maybe somebody else in the call here in the conference knows.
Right. Okay. So there is a question from Kumar, who's asking, what tools does Microsoft provide to monitor the Power Platform and to troubleshoot these issues?
So the report that I mentioned previously, that's the main thing that they're sort of focusing on, that the API usage report, and that will show you how much you're being using per user per day, so that you can actually see that during this day you can download it, you can put it in that, you get an Excel sheet, you can download that, and then you can pivot it, and you can see, okay, so we're actually getting this type of it's these users that are causing the problem from an entitlement perspective. There's no way that you can get a report, as I am aware of anyway, for if you sort of constantly hitting the throttling or the API service protections. So from that perspective, I'm not sure that there is a way that you can sort of monitor that. That's more up to when you implement the code, that you need to sort of make sure that you take that into consideration.
Thank you. Niels is asking, Gustav, we are using the data export feature to export telemetry and logging data to application insights. Is this included in the API limits?
It's a good question. I don't. I haven't seen anything about the data export service or the Azure data lake, the Azure Synapse link, which synchronizes data to the um, to a data lake. I don't know if those are counted in this. I would be surprised if they aren't, but I haven't seen anything explicitly saying either in the one direction or the other. So it, I don't think it actually says it this time. And we, so sorry, I can't answer that question really because I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. Ryan is asking, is there a way to see accumulated entitlements for tenant or environment, i.e., instead of having to work it out manually, is there a dashboard? I know you've answered this question before, but do you have anything to add to that, Gustav? Sorry.
No, I think the report that you can get download from Microsoft when it's currently in private preview, that will give you the summed report, and then you can just pivot it in Excel. Once it's released in public preview, I can create a video on YouTube showing how to do that, and then you can see the total usage per day, because it's typically per day that you want to see that.
Awesome. And thank you, Carsten, for sharing the tenant-wide reporting preview link there. So that's going to be helpful for those people who want to access that preview, that upcoming preview that you've mentioned, Gustav.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you there. And he's saying, Kumar, the Power Platform is a SaaS offering, so performance is also covered in the SLA that is provided for those online services. So the next question is Ryan is saying, thanks, Carsten, but unfortunately, I cannot see anything related to accumulated entitlements, only accumulated usage of entitlements. I'd love to see the usage versus entitlements. There's a question by Philip Cole asking, are flow actions called by Power Virtual Agents still counted differently?
I believe that one of the things that are whitelisted are flows because they are calculated. They have a capacity calculation that's different. I think it's sort of still a bit undecided. I don't know if Carsten has more input into this, but as far as I've understood, the flows are not calculated from an API call perspective because they have their own capacity cost. So that's how I've understood it. It's not very clear. So I think we would have to sort of either ask Microsoft to clear that up.
So Joe Scully is asking, I'm sorry, stupid question. Are these limits per day or per month?
Per day.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other questions? There's one more question. Joe's asking, do you believe Microsoft when they say it might only affect 5% of customers? Hope it's not just Microsoft introducing another tax that will be increased in the future.
It's a good question. When they released the first version of this with a 100K exception, I did not believe it. I think the one that they have now is a lot better. I think large enterprise customers typically have massive integrations and very complicated integrations to many systems. That will of course be causing a lot of API calls. For those, I do think that you have to have a deep conversation with Microsoft to sort of iron out how this is supposed to be handled. If you have 10,000 users, of course, I mean you will be way above that 10 million ceiling, the cap that they have. So you need to sort of have a discussion with Microsoft about this, and hopefully you can talk to somebody that actually understands this. The problem is it's a bit technical. So if you're just talking to account managers, they don't usually want to go this deep into the platform. So.
Lewis is asking, is it possible to have a link to your blog to find all the information presented?
Yes. I can show you my blog. It's super, super easy. It is Power Platform. I hope you can remember that.
Okay. So there's another comment. The reason of setting up service limits is about protection. It could be a bad experience if 10,000 users are affected by one user that's caused the trouble due to stressing the backend systems. Michael Ferro is asking, Flow have counting limits per executions and per actions based in the type of action, premium or not? I think that's more for comment. And I believe, thanks for sharing your blog there. So any other questions? I think that's the last of the questions. So whilst we wait for any final questions, Gustav, do you have any other comments or announcements to make?
No, I think the important thing is if this is affecting you, just go into the documentation and really study up on this, because it's important. And if it's you as an organization, or you have a customer that's affected by this, you need to know this. You need to understand what this is about. So you can read my blog where I try to do some analysis on it, but also do start with the Microsoft documentation, of course. And I'd be more than happy to discuss this more, and you can add comments on my blog as well if you like. I do moderate all them all, so they won't be published at once, but I'll see them. So
great stuff. Well, again, thank you, Gustav, and a big thanks from our community here. Lewis, Philip Cole, Alexander, Kumar have all said thank you very much for this great presentation. It's been very, very helpful and insightful.
Okay, great. I'm happy to help.
So that was Gustav. Thank you once again joining us today, all the way from Canary Islands via Sweden. Fantastic. Okay, so we will be starting our next session in 5 minutes.